Green Space and Redlining Practices in Minneapolis by Livy Ruka, University of St. Thomas Geography and Environmental Studies. Parks and green space are key elements to life in Minneapolis. Not only are parks aesthetically pleasing, but they also lead to more exercise. More parks means more physical exertion. Green space also clears the mind and improves mental health, according to the Trust for Public Land. Stress-inducing urban areas with parks readily available lead to greater quality of life for residents. Overall, parks and green space result in increased physical and mental well-being. Now, another topic, redlining. Redlining is a banking practice that made it impossible to get loans for properties in racially diverse neighborhoods. Redlining practices were first enforced in Chicago in the early 1900s, before 1910. When Minneapolis city officials heard of these discriminatory practices in Chicago, they were quick to adopt the practice, fearing Chicago minorities would journey up north if they took no action. So, redlining practices were enforced in Minneapolis from 1910 to 1968, when the Fair Housing Act was put into place. But, for nearly 60 years, these discriminatory practices were enforced in Minneapolis, and they were largely hidden from the public, according to issue number 6 of Open Rivers Journal. Racially restrictive deed covenants were the backbone of redlining. These covenants were organized efforts to create racially homogeneous neighborhoods. They nurtured emerging racial prejudice and stereotypes. According to the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, the development of redlining was an exercise in the racialization of urban space. This is a problem because urban areas are centers of community and cultural exchange, but because of redlining, deteriorating neighborhoods were associated with Black behavior and culture. The effects of redlining and the association of deteriorating neighborhoods with Black behavior and culture lasted for decades. According to Emily Badger of The Upshot, redlined zones and maps became self-fulfilling prophecies because these zones did not receive adequate investment and continued to deteriorate. The Veterans Administration and the Federal Housing Administration decided who was worthy of home loans, and these redline zones did not cut it. Without affordable loans and mortgages, the quality of real estate, willingness of investors, and prices of property all decrease. Blacks and minorities were forced to turn to contract sales, resulting in steep interest rates and population instability. During the time period of redlining, people looked at these rundown neighborhoods and made the assumption that the people living there, mostly blacks, did not value their homes. However, this is an inaccurate assumption because the reason these homes were run down is because blacks struggled to get credit for maintenance. Now, so what? Why is the topic of redlining so important to understand the city dynamic of Minneapolis today? Well, because blacks were unable to buy homes, they never developed the equity that would allow their kids and grandkids to buy homes. This is a vicious cycle of poverty still apparent today. Differences in levels of segregation, home ownership rates, home values, and credit scores are also still apparent today, despite these boundaries being drawn decades ago, according to Emily Badger of The Upshot. Overall, the University of Minnesota-based Mapping Prejudice Project conveys that racially divided neighborhoods in Minneapolis today are not natural outcomes, but explicit interventions. Before starting GIS research, I asked myself, does the presence of parks and green space in historically redlined neighborhoods in Minneapolis have an effect on neighborhood quality today? And do these neighborhoods with parks still have a strong minority population, or have they become gentrified? First, I created a vulnerability model. Using Census 2010 and American Community Survey block group data, I formulated outputs of % age 65 plus, % rent burdened, % no high school, and homeowner % with the featured raster tool. I then reclassified the outputs using the reclassify tool to get 4 standardized outputs. With the raster calculator tool, I created a vulnerability layer. This map conveys vulnerability within the 7-county metro area. Dark red indicates more vulnerable, and light red indicates less vulnerable. The map shows the most vulnerable people in the downtown area at the center of the map. To connect racial covenants in green space, the most desirable green spaces in Minneapolis were ringed by residential districts that barred people of color from residing. According to the Open Rivers Journal, these covenants blanketed neighborhoods adjoining the best aspects of the Minneapolis park system, acting as a hidden racial barrier. After the vulnerability model, I created an access model conveying access to parks. Using the 2016 Generalized Land Use Layer, I formulated a friction of distance output with the feature to raster tool. I then used the cost distance tool to create an access layer. This map conveys access to parks in relation to homeowners' loan corporation neighborhoods or neighborhoods that could have been redlined. Yellow indicates high accessibility and blue indicates low accessibility. This is the same access map, just zoomed in on the Hulk neighborhoods. Yellow still indicates high accessibility and blue low. Next, using the vulnerability, hazardous neighborhoods, and accessibility input layers, I created outputs of demographic vulnerability of hazardous neighborhoods and access to parks of hazardous neighborhoods using the zonal statistics as table tool. Hazardous neighborhoods in this case are historically redlined neighborhoods. This GIF conveys vulnerability of hazardous neighborhoods in relation to 7-county metro area vulnerability. And this GIF conveys access to parks of hazardous neighborhoods in relation to 7-county metro area vulnerability. This scatterplot conveys access and vulnerability, and this scatterplot shows that there are many vulnerable people in historically redlined neighborhoods with high access to parks. This is a very positive outcome, but an outcome that would not be the same in any other city in America because of the abundance of parks and green space in Minneapolis. Now, moving on to gentrification. This map conveys percent white less than or equal to 75% in the 7-county metro area. This map conveys percent white less than or equal to 25%. And this is the same map zoomed in. Percent white less than or equal to 25% connects closely to vulnerability in hazardous neighborhoods, as well as the 7-county metro area as a whole. Look how closely minority population, hazardous neighborhoods, and vulnerability are correlated. Overall, the presence of parks and green space in historically redlined neighborhoods in Minneapolis affects neighborhood quality today. Although pockets of redlined neighborhoods are still vulnerable today, there are many vulnerable people with high access to parks and green space. Regarding gentrification, historically redlined neighborhoods have become gentrified in some areas, but in others there remains a strong minority population. Minority population connects closely with proximity to downtown. Some suggestions and further research on where to add new parks. Historically redlined neighborhoods. Despite the overall positive outcome, conveying high access to parks in historically redlined areas, there are still other factors that must be taken into account. For example, safety and park quality. If it is unsafe to get to a poor quality park, is it worth going to? Another suggestion regarding future research is looking into access and vulnerability in other American cities. The results will not be as positive, considering Minneapolis is the #1 city in America for parks and green space, and St. Paul is #2, according to the park score from the Trust for Public Land.